It was Easter Sunday in Birmingham, Alabama. A warm spring breeze swept across the neighborhood as families gathered to celebrate. It was supposed to be a day of peace, of faith, of family. A day to share laughter, good food, and memories that would last a lifetime. For 27-year-old Mickese James Bostic, it was more than just Easter. It was his daughter's birthday. His home was full of joy, balloons floated above a backyard grill, music echoed off the walls, and children darted around the yard, hunting Easter eggs with shrieks of delight. Inside, the kitchen buzzed with the clatter of pans and the scent of baked ham and sweet desserts. Family and friends came and went, smiling, hugging, settling into the warmth of celebration. Mickese was in his element. A devoted father of 3, and a father figure to 2 more children through his long-term relationship with Shatice Jackson, he wore responsibility with quiet pride. Everyone at the party knew him as the guy who stepped up. Who made things happen? Who put his kids first? He moved from room to room, checking in on guests, handing out drinks, making sure everyone had a plate. But underneath the smiles and festive air, there was a growing tension no one wanted to name. Shatice arrived that afternoon with some of the children. To anyone watching closely, something seemed off. She was quiet, withdrawn, her usual energy noticeably absent. Some brushed it off. Maybe she was tired. Maybe it was just the chaos of trying to wrangle kids on a holiday. But the silence didn't last. Around 4:30 p.m., a few people noticed Mickese and Shatice in the kitchen. Their voices were low, but their faces told a different story. It wasn't a casual disagreement, it looked like something deeper, something simmering. One guest later recalled seeing them standing stiffly, speaking through clenched jaws before quickly quieting when someone interrupted to ask about the cake. That moment passed. But the tension didn't. Less than an hour later, they were gone from the main room. A few guests noticed they'd moved to one of the bedrooms. And that's when things took a darker turn. Behind the closed door, their argument escalated. Voices rising. A thud. Something falling. Then, a single sound that cut through the celebration like a knife, a gunshot. The party erupted into chaos. Parents scrambled to grab their children. Plates clattered to the floor. People shouted, ducked, ran for the exits. Some thought someone had been shot, others didn't wait to find out. The atmosphere turned instantly from joyful to terrified. But then the door opened. Shatice stepped out first. In her hand was a firearm. Behind her, Mickese followed. Amazingly, he wasn't hit, the shot had gone into the ceiling. Still, his face was pale, his eyes wide with something between disbelief and exhaustion. He tried to take control of the panic. "The party's over," he said. "Everyone needs to leave." It was surreal. Moments ago, they'd been cutting cake and laughing. Now, people were herding their children out the door, trying not to make eye contact with the woman still holding a weapon. Some stayed behind to help calm things down, to figure out what had just happened. Others couldn't get away fast enough. The fight wasn't over. Outside, in full view of lingering family members and neighborhood onlookers, the argument reignited. Mickese and Shatice stood in the yard, still shouting. A few people tried to intervene, pleading with them to calm down, to separate. But their words fell flat. No one expected what came next. Shatice turned and walked toward her car, parked on the street just beyond the driveway. Some assumed she was leaving. That whatever this was, it had reached its breaking point and she was going to drive away. But she didn't. She got in. And a moment later, the car wasn't backing out of the driveway. It was accelerating, fast, straight toward the yard. Straight toward Mickese. What happened next was something witnesses would replay in their minds over and over again. There was no swerving, no hesitation. The tires hit the curb. Then the grass. Then Mickese. The impact threw him against the house. Screams filled the air. People ran toward him. Others stood frozen in shock. It all happened so fast, seconds that shattered the lives of everyone who saw it. When emergency responders arrived, the scene was chaotic. Family members were crying. Children were being held tightly, some too young to even understand what they had just witnessed. Mickese was gone. Pronounced dead at the scene. And the woman who had just taken his life, his longtime partner, the mother of the children they had raised together, was gone too. She'd driven away, leaving behind a yard littered with Easter eggs and horror. Later that night, she was arrested and taken into custody. But nothing about that could undo what had already happened. A man was dead. 5 children, some of whom had been raised together as siblings, were left without their father. Left with trauma that no child should ever have to carry. And as the shock began to settle into grief, one question echoed louder than the rest. How did a day meant to celebrate life end in such unimaginable death? The flashing red and blue lights bathed the quiet Birmingham neighborhood in a surreal glow. The laughter of children that had filled the evening air hours earlier was replaced by a silence so heavy, it pressed down like a storm cloud. Inside that stillness was a sense that something had cracked, a family, a future, a life. Shatice Jackson sat in the back of the patrol car, her expression unreadable. Her children were now in the care of others, their holiday memories forever scarred by the violence they'd just witnessed. Officers whispered nearby, their faces hardened not by indifference but by experience. Even the most seasoned among them struggled to understand how an Easter celebration could unravel into a scene so senseless. Back at the house, forensic teams combed through shattered pieces of a night that had spiraled out of control. They marked the trajectory of the tire tracks in the yard, the cracked siding of the house, the damage to the vehicle. Every inch told part of a story the court would eventually try to piece together. What no police report could fully capture, however, was the ripple effect of what happened on Lisa Lane that night. Mickese's family remained at the scene long after his body was taken away, stunned into silence. His mother, in a state of shock, kept repeating the same words: he loved her. He loved those kids. It was true, Mickese had been the glue in a difficult relationship. Those close to the couple had seen the red flags, the tension, the fights that sometimes got loud, even physical. But love, especially when children are involved, has a way of convincing people that things will change. That this time will be different. That it's worth one more chance. In the days that followed, grief turned to anger, and anger gave way to questions. Everyone who knew them had a version of the story. Some called it a tragedy years in the making. Others swore they'd seen Jackson become more volatile over the last year. One neighbor recalled a shouting match months earlier that ended with the sound of a door slamming so hard it shook the windows. But even with all the signs, no one expected it would ever go this far. As the investigation progressed, details began to emerge that painted a disturbing picture of the couple's final hours together. Witnesses revealed that Jackson had been drinking earlier in the day. Others said the argument started over something as small as a missed phone call, but escalated quickly, as old grievances resurfaced. There was yelling, accusations, and then, what investigators believed to be a moment of chilling calculation. After storming out the first time, she returned. But she wasn't done. According to sources close to the investigation, Jackson entered the house with a gun and fired a single round, not at anyone, but into the floor. A warning? A threat? Maybe a cry for control. What's certain is that the bullet was just the beginning. By the time she got into the car, something had shifted in her. Mickese stood outside the house, likely thinking the worst had passed. But Jackson didn't just back out of the driveway and leave. She accelerated. Fast. The impact crushed Mickese against the brick wall. There was no second chance. No time to move. Just silence, and then chaos. At her arraignment, Jackson stood before the judge in a gray jumpsuit, her hands cuffed, her voice barely above a whisper. The charge: capital murder. The reason? Because one of their children was reportedly in the car when it happened. Under Alabama law, committing murder in the presence of a child makes the crime eligible for the harshest penalty the state can impose. The courtroom was packed. Reporters, family members, legal experts, they all came to see the woman now at the center of a growing storm. Her attorney asked for bond. The judge denied it. Back at the Bostic household, the pain was still fresh, the wound still open. Photos of Mickese decorated the living room, birthday parties, family barbecues, candid moments with his kids. One photo in particular stood out, him holding his youngest child on his shoulders, both of them laughing, sunlight framing their joy. It was taken just months before the tragedy. Friends remembered him as a man who didn't just show up, he stayed. When his partner struggled, he helped. When bills piled up, he picked up extra hours. He worked at the juvenile court not just as a job, but as a mission. He believed in second chances. Ironically, he never got one himself. What haunts the family the most isn't just the loss, it's the way it happened. It was personal. Intimate. Not the work of a stranger, but of someone who once loved him, who shared his home, his children, his life. As the media coverage spread, opinions exploded across social media. Some people condemned Jackson outright. Others speculated about years of potential abuse, about mental health, about what it takes to reach a breaking point. But no matter how loud the debate grew, the fact remained, a man was gone, and his children were now caught between two worlds, one buried, and the other behind bars. In the following weeks, the prosecution began preparing their case. They would argue premeditation, intent, the reckless endangerment of her own child. They would show photos, video surveillance, and likely call on the witnesses who watched it all unfold. But behind closed doors, there were whispers of something deeper. A custody dispute. Financial strain. Prior threats. There was talk that Jackson believed Mickese was planning to leave her for good. And that, perhaps, was the final spark that lit the fuse. Still, nothing excused the outcome. No heartbreak, no betrayal, no emotional turmoil could ever make sense of what happened. What was left now were two shattered families, and a legal battle that was only just beginning. Jackson had pleaded not guilty. Her defense team hinted that her mental state at the time would be a factor. Maybe even a central one. They were gearing up to argue that this wasn't a calculated killing, it was a moment of uncontrollable rage, possibly influenced by trauma, medication, or something darker. And while the law would eventually decide her fate, the court of public opinion was already split down the middle. One side saw her as a murderer. The other, a woman pushed past her limit. But neither label could bring Mickese Bostic back. And as the calendar moved further from that Easter Sunday, one thing became clear: this wasn't just a story of domestic violence. It was a story of warnings unheeded, of emotional pressure building behind closed doors, and of a single, devastating choice that turned an ordinary family celebration into a nightmare. The trial was still months away, but one question lingered in the air like smoke. Was this truly a crime of passion, or something much more sinister? The courtroom buzzed with quiet tension. The trial was still weeks away, but pre-trial hearings had begun, small but pivotal moments where glimpses of the battle ahead revealed themselves. On one side, the prosecution stood with a case they believed was ironclad. On the other, Shatice Jackson sat beside her attorneys, eyes fixed forward, silent, unreadable. What became clear in those early proceedings was that this wouldn't be a simple case of right versus wrong. It would be war, fought with expert witnesses, psychological evaluations, and testimonies dredged from the deepest cracks of a fractured relationship. The prosecution laid out its strategy piece by piece: intent, motive, escalation. They would argue that Jackson didn't just snap, she chose. She returned to the scene. She drove toward Mickese knowing exactly what could happen. They pointed to her entering the house with a firearm, discharging it, and then returning to the vehicle. The tire tracks told part of the story. The damage to the home, the blood, the silence after impact, all of it, the prosecution claimed, pointed to deliberation. But the defense had other plans. They painted a portrait of a woman spiraling, mentally exhausted, emotionally battered, suffering in silence. They suggested that Jackson had been pushed past her breaking point, not just by a rocky relationship, but by untreated trauma. They hinted at postpartum depression, episodes of paranoia, sleepless nights, financial desperation. One motion even requested a full psychiatric evaluation. Their narrative wasn't about premeditation, it was about collapse. In the days outside of court, the city wrestled with its own emotions. News anchors tiptoed around the more explosive details. Social media remained divided. Every new headline became fuel for arguments online. Was this murder or madness? A crime of cold blood or of broken spirit? Meanwhile, those who knew Mickese mourned in quieter ways. A memorial had been erected in the yard where he died, flowers, candles, photos, and a simple wooden cross bearing his name. His mother visited often, standing in the grass with tears streaming down her face, whispering prayers into the wind. And yet, even as the prosecution prepared to argue for the harshest possible sentence, capital murder, the human details kept emerging. One of Mickese's co-workers at the juvenile court remembered how he used to bring donuts on Fridays. How he stayed late to help kids in trouble with the system. How he once lent a struggling teen his own shoes so the boy wouldn't be humiliated in court. He wasn't just a name in a case file. He was a man who tried, every single day, to make life a little better for the people around him. But that only made the loss harder to understand. Especially for the children. Counselors were brought in. Custody arrangements were tangled in the wreckage of the case. Mickese's side of the family pushed for full custody. Jackson's supporters fought back. A judge would have to decide where the children would live, who would raise them, who could visit. In the middle of it all, 2 young lives, too young to fully grasp what had happened, were left without the 2 people they knew best. The children had been there that night. One inside. One in the car. What had they seen? What did they remember? Court records were sealed to protect them, but the trauma was unavoidable. Some nights they cried without reason. Other times they refused to speak at all. A therapist later described it as the kind of psychological wound that doesn't show up on X-rays. And while the legal wheels turned slowly, behind closed doors, both legal teams were preparing for the possibility of a plea deal. The DA's office knew the burden of proving intent beyond a reasonable doubt would be heavy, especially if the defense succeeded in painting Jackson as mentally unstable. The defense, meanwhile, seemed to recognize the danger of gambling with a capital murder charge. Because if the jury saw it as cold, calculated, Shatice Jackson could face life without parole. Or worse. But no deal had been offered yet. And the case trudged forward. Then, something unexpected surfaced. Text messages. Dozens of them, spanning the weeks before the incident. Arguments. Threats. Apologies. Promises. A cycle of tension and reconciliation that revealed a storm brewing long before the night of April 9th. In one message, Jackson accused Mickese of turning everyone against her. In another, she warned him to stop playing with her emotions. And then, silence, until the night of the killing. The prosecution saw it as motive. The defense saw it as emotional deterioration. At the center of it all stood the truth, fractured, murky, and still unraveling. Friends on both sides were forced to reckon with uncomfortable realities. Those who had once laughed with the couple at barbecues now sat on opposite sides of a courtroom. Those who had ignored the warning signs, who had shrugged off the fights, who had believed things would eventually settle down, they were left wondering if they could have done something. Said something? Stopped something. Vigils were held for Mickese. Fundraisers were launched for the children. And petitions surfaced, some demanding justice, others demanding mental health reforms for domestic violence cases. Because whether you believe Jackson was a murderer or a woman broken by circumstance, the fact remained. This didn't have to happen. But as the clock ticked down to opening statements, one final question hung in the air like smoke. Would the jury see a killer, or a victim? The courtroom was packed when the trial finally began. The air felt heavy, thick with the weight of uncertainty. The prosecution wasted no time, diving into the details of the crime, showing photos of the scene, the bullet holes, the blood-stained floor. They painted the story of a woman who had, in their eyes, methodically ended a life. Shatice Jackson, they argued, had planned Mickese Bostic's death from the moment she entered his home that night. She had driven there with intent, knowing exactly what she was about to do. The defense, however, countered with a different narrative. They painted Shatice as a woman who had been pushed to the brink, caught in the suffocating grip of emotional torment. They presented her as a victim of circumstances, a mother, struggling with her mental health, isolated, and overwhelmed by the relentless cycle of abuse. This wasn't a case of cold-blooded murder, they argued. This was the tragic result of a woman broken by years of emotional and physical abuse, a woman who had seen no way out, who had finally cracked under the pressure. As the trial unfolded, the emotional toll on the jury was evident. Each witness added layers to the case, each testimony revealing more about the fraught and tangled relationship between Shatice and Mickese. But as the evidence mounted, so did the doubts. Then came the most pivotal moment in the trial. Shatice Jackson herself took the stand. She was calm, almost eerily composed, as she told her side of the story. She spoke about the arguments, the insults, the emotional abuse. She spoke about the nights when she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, hearing Mickese's harsh words echoing in her mind. She spoke of the crushing loneliness, the moments when she felt like she was losing control of her own life. And then, she described the night of the shooting. Her voice wavered as she recalled entering the house, gun in hand, but her demeanor remained unchanged. She spoke of an argument that spiraled out of control, a moment where fear and anger collided. The gun went off, she claimed, in a flash of panic. She didn't remember aiming it. She didn't remember pulling the trigger. All she remembered was the silence after. Her testimony was met with skepticism, of course. The prosecution argued that if the shooting had truly been an accident, why had she returned to the car so deliberately? Why had she fled the scene? They painted her actions after the shooting as evidence of guilt, of someone who knew exactly what she had done and who tried to cover it up. But as Shatice's defense attorney delivered his closing arguments, he reminded the jury of the many layers of abuse that had led to that moment. He spoke of how she had been pushed beyond her limits, how her mind had been worn down by years of turmoil. He urged the jury to consider her mental state, to see her as a woman who had been broken and not as a cold-blooded killer. The jury deliberated for days. Tensions were high, and everyone was waiting for an answer. What would they decide? Would Shatice Jackson be sentenced to life in prison, or would she be granted a chance at redemption? The emotions in the courtroom were raw, and even as the final verdict loomed, no one could truly predict how it would end. And then, the moment came. The jury had reached a decision. When the verdict was read aloud, the room seemed to hold its breath. The words came slowly, deliberately. We, the jury, find the defendant, not guilty of murder in the first degree, but guilty of manslaughter. It was a verdict that shocked everyone in the room. Not guilty of murder, yet still guilty. Shatice Jackson had been found responsible for Mickese's death, but the jury had determined that her actions were not premeditated. It was, as the jury saw it, a tragic accident born from a life of torment and suffering. As the judge read the sentence, 20 years in prison for manslaughter, Shatice Jackson remained still, her face unreadable. Her supporters let out quiet sighs of relief, while Mickese's family wept in disbelief. There would be no death sentence, no life sentence without parole. Just 20 years. The case, though, didn't end with the sentencing. As Shatice was escorted out of the courtroom, the debate continued. Was justice truly served? Had the right decision been made? The answer, of course, was never simple. Mickese Bostic's death had left a wound that would never fully heal. His children would grow up without him, and his family would carry the weight of that night for the rest of their lives. For Shatice, the future was uncertain. Her conviction had been handed down, but she would serve her sentence with the constant question hanging over her head. Had she truly been a victim, or had she crossed a line that no amount of pain could excuse? And what of the children, the ones who had witnessed it all, who would carry the scars of that night into their adulthood? What kind of future awaited them? The case of Mickese Bostic's death wasn't just a tragedy, it was a reflection of the complex, often painful realities of domestic violence. It showed how the lines between victim and perpetrator can blur, how the consequences of abuse can manifest in ways no one expects. As for Shatice, her fate was now sealed. She would serve her time, but the deeper questions would linger, questions about responsibility, about mental health, and about the devastating impact of a broken relationship. The story of Mickese Bostic and Shatice Jackson, once just another headline, would remain etched in the memory of those who followed it. It was a reminder that behind every crime, every tragedy, there are layers of pain, choices, and consequences that we may never fully understand. The case of Mickese Bostic was over. But for those who loved him, for those who lived through that night, the questions would never truly stop. If you found this case as gripping as we did, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to True Crimes Now, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next deep dive into the world's most chilling and unresolved cases. Until next time, stay curious, and stay safe.